this is coming through here.
And it
Okay, I'm recording my audio.
it should
So
message
be up.
you there.
Yeah, I don't know why, but like the Twitter app is just not working for me right now. It's just like,
Oh, really? Like on your phone?
No, this is on my desktop.
Okay.
Oh no, it's just Firefox being garbage. Okay. Yeah, it just crashed. All right. Let me load that again.
Okay.
Oh man.
God,
Firefox is like, I like it most of the time, but then sometimes they just do this like wonky stuff. So are we live right now, I guess?
Yeah. Yep, we're live right now.
So what do you use? Okay, cool. All right, let me just, I'm just going to retweet this.
Yeah, that'll be the Periscope stream.
And Periscope. Okay, cool.
It's also on YouTube and everything else, but that's usually the one people can watch on in their Twitter app, so it works.
Oh, okay,
works better.
Is Periscope with Twitter? I'm like, you are like, see, this is the strength you have over me when it came to like programming and stuff.
Yeah.
Is that you just are like live and breathe like software. You're like, okay, you know what? There's this app and there's this. So you already have that kind of thing. And I'm like the opposite. I'm like, I like the programming part, but I was like, nah, I never heard of that before. No, I've never used that before. I'm like, I'm gonna become like 50 years from now. I'm gonna be like, yeah, no, I'm not using that. What are the kids doing these days? I don't understand that. So it's a different strength. It's a different skill set, you know.
Yeah, except I'm I'm also the guy that is still using like really old software, like Fireworks CS5 and Dreamweaver and all these other things.
Dreamweaver. Oh man, that brings me back. Wow. Dreamweaver. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's funny because I remember like really early days, some of my like computer science classes, and there would be two types of kids in the class. Like there'd be one kid who would be like, I was more this kind of kid, like you do the programming homework and you're doing it fine, this kind of thing. And then there would be like another kind of kid who would be like, you know, downloading scripts and like hacking into this and doing this, but they didn't do the homework, or like they couldn't do the homework or something like this. It's just like a different kind of personality set. So I think in some ways, honestly, the second skill set is, I don't want to say it's more useful because they have different purposes, but like the guy that does most of our programming or most of our developing right now, he actually does like only programming when he absolutely has to. It's almost always, is there a plugin that already does this? Has someone already figured out a way to do this? Like anytime you're developing something from scratch, you're kind of already going down the wrong path a little bit for commercial stuff, because it's just so much less work to just use something someone else has made.
Totally. Hey, I wonder if I should I don't know if you'll be able to use this, but I'm going to give you the chat URL. You probably don't want this.
Oh, okay.
This will distract you and ruin this whole interview.
It's just going to ruin it.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Let's do it anyways. Watch it just crash my computer when I open this. That would be par for the course for me. Restream.io.
Yeah, that'll just show you any incoming chats.
Chat is ready to display messages. We will find some messages to display.
Yeah, so we've got Will saying, hey, how's it going, Will? Hey, I'm a maker. I don't know who that is, but Hey, I'm a Maker says nothing does tables like Dreamweaver, which is true. If you're still doing HTML emails, then Dreamweaver, that's the place to be, man. Because you can do great tables and all your table layouts.
This is gonna be me saying basically that like Justin knows a million times more about like what kinds of software and stuff to use. I'm gonna be on this show as the guest and be like, yeah, I've never heard of that before. That's gonna be the entire episode. No, I don't know what that is. Never heard. Glad to have you, Scott. Yeah.
All right. So if our audio sounds okay, hey Reed, how's it going? Hey Chris. Hey Dimitri.
I can see it too, so hey everyone.
Scott can see this as well. This is Scott. We're going to be recording an episode of Product People. How does the audio sound out there? I know there's a little bit of a delay. We're going to be talking about Scott's book, which I can show you on screen here. This is Ultra Learning.
I've got like you can see in the back here, I've actually got the jackets I don't know why they send the jackets first before the actual book. So I have other copies, but this is what the book's gonna look like. There's no book inside.
Sweet.
It's just nothing. But this is what it will look like when you get one.
Yes.
So yeah.
That's going to be awesome. And this is your first book with a major publisher, hey?
Yeah, this is my. It's gonna fall off. It's just there's no book inside, so it's just gonna fall right off the shelf. Yeah, this is my first book with a major publisher. I have written some like ebooks before, and I've written like tons of articles and stuff. So this isn't my first time writing, but it was my first time writing a book with a North American publisher. So it's published by Harper Business. It's gonna be out August 6th.
Sweet.
So that's why I don't have the real book here yet.
Sweet. All right, let's try to get into a semi formal interview here. But folks in the chat, if you want to ask questions, you can.
Yeah.
Scott, I've heard some of your other interviews, and I'm going to try. I think what I'd like to do is kind of approach this from the angle of learning to program, because that's something that I've been doing lately. And you called me for like a poll quote last week, and I ended up talking your ear off. So
oh no, it was great. I love the enthusiasm. This is like why I'm like doing this book, is just to like have these conversations with people who are just like, oh my God, like I figured it out. This is how you do it. And that's what I want. So it's great.
Yeah. And I think if we're both pumped up, this will be a better show. So, all right. So we're going to start the official thing right now. Hey everyone, today I'm chatting with my friend Scott Young. How's it going, Scott?
Oh, it's great to be here, Justin.
So we met back in 2017. We're talking about this before we hit record. I think it was Sean Blanc, James Clear, and Sean McCabe put on a little retreat in Colorado, right?
Yeah. There was like about 10 of us there. And I'm really glad that I was able to meet you there. It was a cool time.
Yeah, it was amazing, actually. Like, there's all sorts of different people. Why do you think you got invited? I'm still trying to figure that out. Like, why did you know James or some
James
of the...
recommended me. So James was my invite. Yeah.
Okay, so you knew some.
Yeah, because I didn't. Why did you get invited? That's always the question you want to hear when you go to a party, right? So like, what? Why are you here?
Why were you here? Well, because I was walking around going, why the heck am I here? And it was interesting because it was so many interesting people, some of whom I'd never met before. And I was like, how did this even happen? And so you had met James sometime before?
I've known James for a number of years. And you know what's so funny, because James Clear, well, you did an episode with him on the podcast. I'm sure your audience is familiar with him, but like his book has just become this just like explosion of success.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is that when I first met him, he was kind of friends with some other people and he was just starting his blog. Like I remember really liking him when I met him, but I remember not thinking like, oh yeah, this guy's a really big deal. Like I should. And so it's so funny because now he's very much a really big deal. And so this is my claim to fame, is that I meet all these people before they become much more successful than me. So
yeah. Well, it's cool though, because it also shows you that these are just real people who are doing really what we're doing, which is trying to put out interesting ideas into the world, trying to do research, trying to do all these things. And from what I understand, like, would you describe yourself as a blogger? Is that how you, or a writer?
Yeah. Well, yeah, both. I don't know. Usually when people ask me what I do, I say I'm a writer, because that's like the most, like people kind of, okay, when you say writer, that's what I'm writing all day. That's what you imagine. You say blogger, that kind of sounds, now it's a little bit more of a profession, but definitely like, I don't know, like 5 or 6 years ago when I used to say that to people, it would be like, that's made up, that's BS, or like AKA you're unemployed, or like this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I feel like a writer has a little bit more legitimacy to it, but yeah, I'm a blogger, writer.
And it must feel good, because now you're kind of legit, because you're publishing your first book with a major publisher. It's going to be out on August 6th. That's right.
Yeah, on August 6th. Yeah.
And it's called Ultra Learning.
Ultra Learning.
I want to get into that a little bit. So you write about how, like, well, tell what is the topic of your blog? ScottHYoung.com. And what do you typically write about?
So I write a lot about learning, but this sort of idea of ultra learning has kind of obsessed me over a while. And I kind of go into it, like the kind of story of it in the book. But basically, I wanted to focus on, not on like, how do you get good grades in school or something. Not to say that that's not important, but the idea of the book was people who sort of undertake these projects on their own to learn something hard, and they have, some kind of impressive or incredible results. So there's a lot of really cool people I talk about in the book. One of the guys, Tristan de Montebello, he went from like basically zero experience public speaking to being at the world championship and getting in the top 10 after 7 months just by going through this process. And another guy I talk about in the book, Nigel Richards, won the French World Scrabble Championship. Let me get that right. French World Scrabble Championship. And he can't speak French.
What?
Like, so these are, yeah, I know, it's crazy, right? So these are some of the stories that they're kind of a little extreme, but I wanted to use them to kind of paint a picture of like the potential that you have to learn hard things is a lot more than you think if you know how to go about it the right way. And it's so funny because you and I were just having this conversation about you finally getting into programming. And in my head, the whole time you're talking about what you're doing, I'm like, oh yeah. There's a lot of research on why that's the right way of doing it, which I think is cool.
Okay, I want to get into that, but let's just go back to this French Scrabble thing.
Yeah. Nigel Richards. Yeah. Crazy guy.
That must really piss off the French.
Well, no, this guy is like, he's like one of the most interesting people that I researched for the book, because first of all, like, he's kind of an odd looking guy. Like he's got really long hair with like kind of home cut bangs and like aviator sunglasses. And he kind of like looks a little savantish, but I've heard him in interviews. He's very normal sounding. And he's very mysterious. Like he doesn't he doesn't do interviews with reporters. He declines all media, all this kind of stuff. But he is like been just dominating English Scrabble, and then he just decided, you know what, I'm so good at this. Let's go for a little bike ride in Europe. And he decided, you know what, there's a French World Scrabble Championship. Let's just try to do it. And he just won first place.
What?
So it's kind of funny when you dig into it. It doesn't seem as crazy because not being able to speak the language is definitely a disadvantage, but actually being really good at Scrabble involves having a really impressive mnemonic ability, even beyond the words that you normally encounter. So you have to learn a lot of words, even if you're going to do it in English. So he just did learn words that are different words. They're not words that he knows how to speak. So it was kind of crazy though, how he went about it. But yeah, that's just one of the stories. There's lots of them like that.
Crazy. Okay. I think this will be most interesting for folks if we use an example.
Yeah.
And so I think the example of me learning to program would be a good one to dig into. And so let's just talk about kind of a little of my background, because I think it's applicable. And then we can talk about what I've been doing. And then you can tell me if this is the right thing, if I'm on the right track. We have Dietrich in the comments here saying, is there a right way to learn programming? Which I think a lot of people are asking questions like that. Actually, that is one of my biggest anxieties.
Yeah.
Is, am I learning things the right way? Like, when you're learning to play guitar and you're like, well, is this the right way? Like, maybe there's a better way. There's kind of like this learning FOMO of, well, maybe I'm missing out on the right way. And I think part of that is because often it's presented that there's just one way to learn something. Like there's gurus out there that'll say, well, this is how you learn programming.
Yeah.
And the narrative that develops is, well, if you didn't start when you're 5 years old, and if you weren't like writing, C by the time you were 8, and you're just never going to be a programmer, because that's how people learn to program. So here's my story. I started, my dad brought home a Commodore VIC-20 in 1985. And so I'm 5 years old. I had a computer in my house at 5 years old. And VIC-20s came with BASIC. And I do remember writing a little bit of BASIC. There's like this manual, and you could type things in and make little programs, simple like input, and then it would save the input, and then you can reuse the input. You can print it somewhere. And I remember thinking that was cool. And I also remember just loving computers, like just immediately being into it. And as I got older, I kept being into computers. We got other computers, and I was always trying to figure out how to use them and work them. And then I think when I was around 10, I asked for a copy of Turbo Pascal. And this is where things kind of fell apart for me. I asked for a copy of Turbo Pascal 6.0. I remember this is a big deal. And I wanted to learn to make like games. There was something called a
Mm-hmm.
demo scene back then, which came out of the ANSI art scene on bulletin boards, which is like these people would form these crews of programmers and designers and music people, and they would make these incredible like computer demonstrations.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of like a music video, but with all generated computer stuff. And I was like, okay, I want to do that. So I get Turbo Pascal 6 and I start trying to learn. And, I tried to learn the way other people do. Like
Mm-hmm.
they said, get a book. And I got a book. And I just remember it just didn't work. I kept trying and trying and trying. And then it just, nothing clicked for me. And
Yeah.
I can't remember if that was because, I don't know, maybe because I was trying to do something that was too big. Maybe I was too isolated. I was a kid in the country on a farm, I had really no one around me.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I think, like, I wonder if I was born in New York City, would it have changed anything? Where are you from, actually? You're from Manitoba somewhere?
I'm from like, yeah, I'm from like the middle of nowhere so it's called the Paw, Manitoba. That's where I spent 18 years of my life. So that's like northern Manitoba. So talk about really like middle of nowhere. Not on a farm, but like,
Yeah,
same kind of
small
thing. Yeah,
town.
yeah.
Okay, so why
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
why don't you interject right here?
Sure.
What do you think, like, what am I encountering there as a kid who clearly had this desire
Yeah.
and but it just didn't click?
Mm-hmm.
Is there something you can see even at that stage that's going, well,
Well, so I want to just jump in because there's already people being like, is there a right way to learn a program? So my goal is here not to be like, there's one and only one way to learn a program.
Yeah.
And if you don't follow this, you're an idiot. No, so my goal isn't that. My goal is what are the principles behind learning so that you can kind of self-diagnose your own mistakes where you can be like, oh, that's why it wasn't working because I was doing this.
Yes.
And that's why that works. So really, there's an infinite number of ways of doing it. And you got to find the way that you're going to like. And a lot of what I talk about in Ultra Learning is really making these projects that are very unique so that it's kind of like your project. And that's what I'm trying to move away from is the kind of one size fits all education approach where you go to school and everyone follows the same curriculum and you don't care about this, but who cares what you think? Everyone else in the class has to do it too. And it's that approach.
Yeah.
So what I will say, I can't say specifically what you were doing because I'd have to look at what little Justin was doing with the computer and why it was so difficult. But I will say a couple things. So one of the things I think with programming, and we were just talking about it, and you were talking about spending a lot of videos, is that honest to God, the hardest thing about programming these days is getting set up. Like all the tools, all the dev environments. Like I've been programming probably now for half my life. I'm not a professional programmer, so I'm not going to say that I'm some wizard and I'm talking from high on the mountain of what great programmers do. But I have been programming for a long time, and I can tell you, I still effing hate setting up a new programming language. Like it is like my least favorite thing to do. And it's because it's not like any other computer software. Like if you become like, you want to use Photoshop. Okay, you download Photoshop, bloop, you install Photoshop, and you set it up and you start to work. Programming, no. You got to open your terminal. You got to download this. You got to type in some things. Oh, you're running 64-bit? Oh, it crashed, but you're not sure why. And it's like wrong system architecture. And then you Google that and you copy this and you go again and again and again. And the problem is that people experience this initial thing and they extrapolate. Oh my God, if the first steps are this hard, well, then the rest of programming must be impossible.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just those rare kids that are like okay with being really frustrated in the beginning. And so they can get over that initial hump that they can start actually doing some programming. And then it's like, oh, actually, once you get that like hello world program, or you get those first few lines of code happening, you can actually do a ton of stuff. So I think there's lots of ways around it. Some people are asking like, what should you do if you're like struggling with this? Honest to God, like you were saying the book, one of the things I've done is I just get like an O'Reilly book that tells you step by step because I'm like an old man. Like I don't like looking things up on tutorials.
Yeah.
So I like getting the O'Reilly book that it's like, okay, all right, step 1, type this. And then I like type that. And you feel stupid, but you get through that. And then you actually like, okay, someone got me from step 1 to, actually typing those first lines of code. The other thing I think that people get over is that I think this is the second big problem with programming, is that there's a million different things you can use. So there's a million tools, and everyone's like, no, you got to be learning JavaScript, or no, it's Python, no, it's Rails, and then no, but you got to have the, Node.js, or you got to be doing this, you got to be doing that, and this and this and this. And so it also feels super overwhelming because you're like, oh my God, where do I? And it's only after you've been programming for a while that you realize, yes, the tools are different and there is some learning in those tools, but it's not as if programming, like all programming has a common vocabulary, a common set of concepts that work across. So you're going to be dealing in almost all programming languages, you're going to be dealing with functions, you're going to be dealing with variables, you're going to be dealing with, pointers, you're going to be dealing with for loops, while loops, recursion. There's probably several textbooks worth of ideas that are the same in almost all programming languages. They're just superficially different. So even if you learn the wrong programming language, so you learn Python and you're like, oh no, I actually needed to learn, JavaScript or C++. It's a little bit of work, but it's not like, going from Chinese to French or something. Like it's like going from, French in Montreal versus French in Paris. Like there's a little bit of different words, but a lot of the same concepts.
Yeah.
So I think those are the two big problems.
Is there any, I wonder if there's how much research there is about the importance of having some sort of peer group that's going through it at the same time. Because now that we're going to get to this in a little bit, but one of the things I'm discovering now is I'm able to ask people, just really dumb questions like, how does this work? And when you have someone kind of sitting beside you, you can ask these almost what seems like inane questions. Like, well, maybe in Turbo Pascal, it would have been something about like, I don't know, why do I need to compile this first? Or it doesn't really matter what it was, but it feels like if I had friends that were also programming at the same time, and we were kind of like just batting ideas around, and they would go, oh, well, that's simple. You just step over that like this. Or a good example lately was I was installing a bunch of stuff with Adam Wathan, who's a really good programmer. He's written a bunch of books for the Laravel community. And I'm like, look at all these warnings when you install, like npm install something. Like, it's like warning, warning, warning. And I'm like, what do you, in the command line, right? And I'm like, what do you do about those? Don't those drive you crazy? And he's like, oh yeah, you just ignore those. But when you're a beginner, you don't know what to pay attention to. You don't know what's a big deal, what's not a big deal. And it feels like when you have peers that can go, oh, well, that's not a big deal, but this is a big deal. So what role does like the people around you play? Or is there anything in that? Like,
well, I think you can go both ways. So what you're talking about, where you have like, that's basically the model of tutoring, right? Where that you have like kind of a one-on-one or one to a small group of that kind of coaching. That's the best kind of teaching, because then it's tailored to what is your problem. Whereas if you're in a big class, someone's lecturing, you get confused, they're not stopping to explain why you're confused. Like, you're still stuck, right? So tutoring is very good. I think that, we're in a little bit of a privileged position. If you got, some nice friend who's a superstar and is at hand coaching you, that's great. A lot of us, maybe 5-year-old Justin doesn't have this coach who can tell him exactly what to do.
Someone commented on that video and said, wow, that was like having Gandalf teach you a basic spell.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's obviously something there. But yeah, I think there is something about, actually, that's interesting, because now that you bring that up, like this idea of tutoring, or at least having some sort of pair, like for me, pair programming seems to make a lot of sense with my personality. So are you saying that's part of it, is figuring out like what kind of learner you are?
Well, peers and coaches and tutors are often really valuable. And so that's a big part of the, like, when you're setting up a project, how do you get that scaffolding? So I think someone like you're an extroverted kind of person, and you work in a social way, and that can often be a big motivator. I was talking to a woman who was talking about programming, and she was saying the thing she didn't like about it is that it's so isolating. And I was like, well, maybe you're just doing it wrong. Maybe that's what you're doing it in a nice way. It doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
And so I think that peer groups can also backfire if you're not in that context. So if you're in a context like, let's say, I'll give a good example. Let's say you're in an intro programming class. So this is my third big thing that I think that people screw up and why they think they can't program is you do your intro CS course. And okay, so I have a story time. So I met this woman who got a master's in civil engineering, and she's like writing papers on like fluid dynamics and stuff. So she's wicked smart, right? To use the Goodwill Hunting, she's wicked smart.
Wait, what are fluid dynamics? Is fluid dynamics the dynamics of water? Or is it
water going in hydro dams and stuff? So this is really smart. This is like, differential equations, and this is like complicated, high level stuff.
Okay.
And she told me with a straight face, you know what, I couldn't learn to code because I went to my intro programming class and I was no good at it. And I was like, why is someone this smart saying they weren't good at it? And the reason why is because in every intro class, there's some kid who's been doing it for 10 years and they throw the curve, right? So you're in this class and you're seeing the kid who hands in an assignment in about 20 seconds. And you're like, wait, I don't get what is an if statement? Why do I have to put this INT before the variable name? That doesn't make any sense to me, this kind of thing. And you're getting frustrated and confused, which is totally normal because it's totally new for you. But there's some kid who's, again, been doing this since he was 5 with his computer learning basic. And you look at that and you make that comparison. You say, "Oh, I must not be very good at this." So you don't discount the fact that this person has years of experience. Maybe you don't know that, but you say, "I'm not good at this." And this is definitely what I feel happened in this woman's case, and I think can happen to a lot of us, is that you get in this situation where you make this comparison to other people that maybe isn't a fair one, but it makes you, oh, if I'm at the bottom of the class, I must be bad at this, rather than I don't have the right experience or I'm not approaching it in the right way. And so I think the peer group can be this double-edged sword, that if you have a good peer group, they can like help you learn and support you, or they can just be this like, well, I'm not good at this, I might as well give up and go do something else, right?
That also brings up this idea of convention. One thing that's been helpful to me is before I did look at programmers as if they were Gandalf. Like they are magicians doing things I do not understand. And what's been helpful now is to see that programming was just invented by humans that saw the world in a certain way, and they came up with conventions that made sense to them. In the same way that, if you've got like a really weird way of even like think about the list you have to give guests if they stay at your house. Like, here's how to use the remote. Here's how to unlock our door. Things that seem completely normal to you that are, conventions that make sense. When you actually have to write them out, you're like, this is darn confusing for somebody else. And when I saw that programming was just like, these are conventions, the reason people use this language, use this way of organizing, like even like functions, variables, and as soon as you start saying that stuff, my eyes just glaze over. I'm just like, those words to me are automatically blockers. And it's not until, because I want to get to how I was finally able to get some breakthroughs, but one of the things that really helped me was realizing these are just conventions. And I feel like maybe this is getting back to your earlier point, like a lot of what throws people off is just the kind of the stuff at the beginning that other people have just said, well, this is how you learn math. You've got to sit down and you've got to learn it this way. And if you can't do it or that doesn't click for you, well, then you're screwed. Is any of that, is there any kind of...
No, I totally agree. And I think there's a lot of, again, we're getting into these misconceptions about programming, and I love it because, one of the things I think is a huge misconception about programming is that programming is like a branch of mathematics. And I'm saying computer science is, like, I've done some computer science. I know, like, it is a branch of mathematics. That's a kind of math, especially discrete math. And so people extend that, like, well, it's technology, it's math, it's like engineering, it's like doing calculus or algebra. Not really. And the way that I feel is that programming in it kind of at its core, like I mean, there's certain types of programming that obviously, like if you're doing machine learning, there's a lot of like math and
Yeah.
doing this kind of thing. But most programming is actually a lot closer to like creating a recipe, or
Hmm.
it's a lot more linguistic. It's a lot more like, if I were to explain to someone how to do it and I had to explain it, like I just had to assume that this person is going to just follow it like robotically, and I had to like break it down in explanation. That's a linguistic kind of task.
Hmm.
And a lot of what makes someone a good programmer once they kind of master the basics is not really like how good are you at math, but like how organized are you? How good are you at communicating? What does this program do, and how can I explain how it does to someone else who's going to later maintain this program or
Hmm.
open it up, try to figure it out?
Yeah.
And so it's a lot about being neat and tidy and organized and thinking through, okay, this is a complicated problem. How do I break it down into little components that, so, I want to build an app that does all these million things, but like, how do I, okay, let's figure out, where do I start? What would be the first thing I want it to do? And like, how do I get it to do the next thing? And
Hmm.
so I think there's a lot of misconceptions about programming, and a lot of that's reinforced by those first few experiences where you're like, my vision of like what people think of as programming is like the green letters are dropping down and you're entering the matrix, and someone's like, if you don't crack, they're gonna be through the firewall in 15 seconds, and then they're like typing like 40 million words per second, and like 18 windows are popping up, and like there's a big skull with crossbones, and like the lasers flashing. You know what I'm talking about. This is
Yeah.
how everyone promotes programming, when it's really more like, okay, so I wanted to do this first and then that, so I guess I'll put this thing first. And like it's a
Hmm.
lot, it's not actually that intimidating, but it
Hmm.
feels that way.
Yeah. Well, here's the breakthrough for me. So
Mm-hmm.
I've the other thing I think that sets in that would be interesting to talk about is how I eventually just started believing this thing about myself. So I tried, ages 10, 11, 12, which in some ways seems ridiculous. Like I tried it when I was 10, 11, 12, and then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, but as a kid, you just start to gravitate towards things where you're getting positive feedback. So
Mm-hmm.
I was getting feedback with my writing, so I was doing that. I was getting feedback on like bulletin boards. I would make ANSI art and art for bulletin boards. So I was getting good feedback on that, so I just started doing that. In my family, I was the best at computers, and so I was just getting good, positive
Mm-hmm.
reinforcement about being the best at computers. In my class, I was the best at computers, and there was nobody else in my class going, "Well, but what about programming?" I was
Mm-hmm.
I was I was already the best at computers. And so, and then the web came along in 2013 when I was 13,
Mm-hmm.
and then writing HTML just seemed so much easier and accessible, right? Fast forward a lot of years. Now I'm 39 right now. But last year I said, well, actually at that retreat, I
Mm-hmm.
was chatting with James Clear, and he hadn't published Atomic Habits yet, but
Mm-hmm.
we were talking in the airport, and I think I was being a little bit cynical to him at first. I was just kind of like, well, it's kind of like, this is not for me, Like, James, that stuff might work for like, whatever, but it's not going to work for me.
Yeah.
And to his credit, he was very patient. And also, I think the other thing that happened was I was just watching folks like you and people that I might have normally felt cynically were like, oh, these
Mm-hmm.
people are too earnest, Like, let's just all learn. Let's improve our productivity. Let's be ultra learners. I'm being honest. I'm just
Yeah.
telling you that
No, I like
in
it.
this,
I like
in the
it.
cynical parts of me, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
And then James said this thing, which was basically, you know, every action you take is a vote for the kind of person you want to become. And so if you might not think you're a runner right now if you don't run, but if you got up tomorrow morning and you ran, and then you did it the next day and the next day and the next day, you might start to think of yourself as a runner. And his point was that a lot of these things don't follow our internal beliefs about ourselves. Our beliefs follow the actions that we do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a good way of putting it, you think?
Yeah.
And so my thought when I got back was I've always wanted to learn to program. And now I'm building this new app with John called Transistor.fm. I want to be able to contribute to this in some way. I don't want to just be the marketing guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to figure out something that would work for me. And what I figured out, almost kind of by accident, was every time I did a live stream, I'd be like, okay, I gotta get this done. I gotta start. So I'd just go live and I'd just be like, hey everybody, it's me, and I don't know shit about programming. And that part was hard because I had to give up my ego of, like, there's all this stuff I wanted people to know. Like, I've been on computers since 1985. You know, I was using Unix when I was 10, but I had to kind of almost like let all of that go and be like, but there's a lot of stuff in the command line I don't know or I can't remember. And instead of me trying to hold on to this, like, this perception of myself, I just said, you know what? I'm an idiot. I don't know what I'm doing. I almost played a bigger idiot than I was. But what was helpful about it is that when people showed up in the live stream, they were happy to help me, right? Because I'm not trying to pretend that, I'm not trying to hold it together. I'm just saying I'm here to learn and I want to accomplish this one thing. And that, for me, is the only thing that has ever worked. And we spent a lot of time, a lot of those videos, they're all online. They're just me going through things with people and them going, here's how to set up an environment or whatever. So what do you think? Is there anything in the research or anything? Because to me, that feels like I'm doing it completely wrong, right? Like I'm not reading a book. I still, like, if you ask me to define what a function is, I'd be like, I don't really know.
Yeah.
I have a loose idea of what a variable is. I have a loose idea of what a constant is, but I'm starting to get it for the first time in my life. And I wonder, is that the future of learning? Because I basically, maybe not that specific thing, but me kind of figuring out, oh, wait, maybe there's something that would work better for me than what worked for other people.
So one of the things that I think you're definitely doing right, and this was one of the more surprising things that came up in the research for this book, is basically, you know how classroom learning works, where you learn something in one context, maybe you study for a test or something, and the entire principle of classroom learning is based on the idea of transfer, based on the idea that you're going to learn something in the classroom and you're going to be able to transfer it to real life.
Yes.
And if you dig into the literature, you will find that actually the ability that we have to transfer things is abysmal. It is so bad. So like there are studies. So for instance, I just love these studies. One of them is that there was a study done that high school students who had taken a high school psychology class did no better on a college level psychology class. Another study had economics majors did not do better on questions of economic reasoning than non-economics majors. I mean, this is pretty obvious stuff. Like one class to the next level class, you'd expect some transfer. Or economics, you spend 4 years studying it in college. You really should be able to reason about economic problems better. You can't. And what I think a lot of it is that what's actually happening when you're learning is that if you learn things in that's divorced from the context you actually have to apply it, there's a lot of the little, I'll call it kind of like connective tissue, a lot of the little skills and abilities that you actually need to have to be able to perform it that you are lacking. And because you're lacking that, when you try to transfer it, it fails, or you're able to perform it, but like way worse than you thought you'd be able to. And this can be very dispiriting. And so often if you're in computer science classes, they'll do ridiculous things like getting you to do assignments with pencil and paper because it's easier to grade that way. But actually coding, you never do that. You're always like, oh, what's the syntax for this? And you Google it and then you look it up and you're like, oh, right, this is how you do it, and you put it in.
Yeah.
So one of the first principles of ultra learning. So I divided the book into 9 principles, is what I call directness, and that's exactly what you're doing, which is like, okay, I'm gonna work on this, and I'm gonna open this up, and I'm gonna work on it directly, and like screw the programming book and screw the textbook. I'm just gonna start working on it directly,
Mm-hmm.
and this is actually really good, because not to say that books are always bad or that it's always bad to do those other things. You got to do what you need to do to learn it.
Mm-hmm.
But in the same sense, if you just like, I'm going to work through this whole book and then I'm going to start my first programming project, I think that's backwards.
Yeah.
You should get in your head, okay, what is something little that I could maybe try to work for or try to aim at? And then even when I'm learning things, I'm starting to think about like, how would that work in the thing that I'm trying to do, or even start working on the thing you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
So honestly, I think that the way we conceive of classroom learning is actually backwards, and that the right way to learn things is a lot closer to apprenticeship, which is sort of what you're doing right now.
Yeah. I can't see what you're saying in some ways is a little bit frustrating, because our whole lives we've been said you take the class and then you go out later and you apply it. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And or you read the book and then you know what you're talking about, so then you can go do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it just seems like you and I both took business in school, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've got my degree in business. Completely worthless.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure there's some things that I picked up that were helpful, but it wasn't until I was doing my own business that I started to learn, right?
Yeah.
Like the theory, maybe except for accounting and like having a basic understanding of how accounting worked.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else, in some ways, it was almost worse because it gave me the confidence that I could do it, right?
Oh man, I totally know what you're talking about. So I have this feeling, because I remember it was probably this was my last year when I was in business school. I was getting in these lingering feelings that business school was bullshit, like a while before. But this was where it like really sunk in. And I was taking a class, and oh my God, this was this class where the professor, instead of actually teaching the class, he decided every class, we're just gonna have students present a case and then we'll discuss it. Like just super lazy. Like I don't want to do any work. So like you guys just teach the class. And it was an entrepreneurial finance class. And basically we were given these little case studies. This is very common in business school, if you haven't done it, by the way. You have case studies and you have to like plan, and you're 22 and you're so smart, and you're like going to write about like, this is what this company should do with their business and this kind of thing. I remember we were talking about it, and basically every class they were like sort of like, so given the situation the company's in, like, would you invest, or do you think this is a good company? And the answer was always no. Like, this is not a good company. There's always all these problems with the company. This is not a good company. And the thing that I realized in this moment is that the skill we were learning there was how to like tear apart things and critique them. And the skill of being an entrepreneur is how do you put things together and build them. And they're completely different. And so maybe as an investor, you need to do that a little bit. But even as an investor, like most businesses are bad. Most businesses are failures. It's not a skill to say a business is going to fail. That's anybody that you just say no to everything and you're already going to get it right about 80% of the time.
Yeah.
The skill is when to say yes.
Yeah.
Or the skill is how to take problems and like, oh, your supplier is like not supplying you anymore. What do you do? Or you don't have any customers, or this just failed, or your business partner's suing you. Like, what do you do? This is what it actually means to start a business. And so we were talking about programming, but it's exactly the same way that you learn how to do these things in computer science classes, is like real fancy little algorithms. So like I, for instance, know how to write the algorithm for a quicksort. You know how many times I've used that in writing an actual program? 0. You know why? Because you never write the quicksort algorithm. They've already implemented the language. You just like sort that list, right? So there's a usefulness in knowing these things, but at the right time. And so I think often learning is a question of sequencing. What do you do first? What do you do second? And in school, they're kind of like, well, you're going to learn it all anyway, so it doesn't matter what the sequence is. And I completely disagree that it really matters where you start, because that's where you build momentum. That's where you start actually doing things. And so, don't teach them the quicksort if they don't need the quicksort until they're at the level where it's like, oh no, I actually need to implement a more efficient sorting algorithm because I have this huge, application, and then this is what is important.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that I think we've internalized about the right way to learn things that are just like completely bogus.
Yeah, and in that example, it is way more motivating
Hmm.
to build something small and then figure out the limitations of what you've built, or run into a roadblock and then go, oh, wait, that built-in quicksort function, that's not going to be enough because it's,
Hmm.
it's slowing down, or my data set's bigger or whatever. And
Hmm.
at that point, to be able to go, okay, well, now I can see the need for this other thing, right?
Yeah, or if you need to do something that's not built in, it's like, okay, there's no easy way to do this anymore. Now I better actually learn some things.
Yeah.
So again, it's not to say that learning quicksort is a bad thing, or that you shouldn't have done that, or that I shouldn't have done that. Obviously, like, knowing how the quicksort works is a good thing to learn. It's just a question of how do you sequence it? How do you order things when you're learning? And what are you doing when you start learning? Because again, these transfer issues, we were talking about business school, and I gave a talk where I was kind of like criticizing my business school education a little bit. And I go up to the speech, and this woman comes up to me after, and she's like, you know what? I teach entrepreneurship in business school. So there's a little like, oh, geez, okay. All right. And she was saying, you know what? We already, or like her specifically, he's like, I already agree with everything you're saying. And I really try to get the students to like apply it and go doing things. And they don't want to. They're like, no, 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 this isn't going to be on the test. I'm not doing this. And so this is also kind of the message of my book, is not to like, attack the teachers, or like, Mrs. Brownlee, who like taught you wrong in grade 10, and that's why everything's bad in your life. It's rather that we need to, as learners, as students, to take initiatives and try to actually go out there and design our own things, like what you're doing right now, and make up for our own weaknesses and our own deficits, and not just blame everyone else around us for not giving us the ideal education we deserve.
Yeah, yeah. So if you were going to redesign school,
Hmm.
how would you change it?
Well, I think the starting point is trying to get out of thinking things in terms of schools in the first place. So this is one of the things that I've been having these conversations, and this is sort of like a very common question, I guess. So
Yeah.
like, what would you do differently in school? And I think the problem is that we try to learn a lot of things in the school box, where the school box is maybe not the best box to put it in. So a good example of this is learning languages. So we can talk about this as well, but I've learned a couple languages, and I think it's very difficult within the structure of how a school typically works, where you have one teacher, maybe 20 to 30 students to be economical, and you have a classroom environment, and there's like a lesson, and then there's some homework. Within those constraints, it's actually kind of difficult to have an effective language learning procedure, because what you probably need to do is do what you're doing. You get a lot of one-on-one feedback. You actually have a communication goal, like you're actually trying to order food at a restaurant, or you're actually trying to talk to this person about something. So
Mm-hmm.
you're not so caught up in like, no, you conjugated that incorrectly, or that's masculine and it's
Yeah.
not feminine. But it's like, no, 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 I'm actually trying to get this pizza right now. And like, if I get the pizza, then transaction successful, and we'll worry about masculine and feminine later, and this kind of
Yeah.
thing. And so this is the way that I'm really trying to promote this ultra learning, is to get people to think outside of this box. And so you're outside of this box right now with your live streaming and programming. But I think a lot of us, we think inside this box. And if you weren't successful inside that box, you've just convinced yourself that there was no way for you to do it. And I think that's kind of sad.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, using languages as an example,
Yeah.
I mean, so I was in French immersion growing up. And
Okay.
there's definitely a benefit to it because I'm just immersed in it all the time,
Yeah.
right? But and to a certain extent they do this, and there's a benefit to it. But like you said, when I was in France, that's when it really became alive, right? Is like,
Mm.
I've got to communicate to these people in a way that they can understand me, and then I'm like, okay, well, how do I do this? And I think there always needs to be this interplay between, if you are going to have like theory, like you have to learn the grammar or whatever,
Hmm.
you almost always immediately need a way to apply it in a real situation. Otherwise, at least for me, the motivation is gone, because, if I'm not like out ordering pizza, and I wouldn't order pizza in France. If I'm ordering like a good wine in France or something like
Right,
that,
right.
I want to be able to do it without embarrassing myself. That's the motivation. And that would make me motivated to get back into the classroom and go, okay, well, now I'm going to figure out, grammar, because I'm tired of misconjugating these things in real life. But outside of context, like outside of real application,
Yeah.
why It just doesn't make sense, you know?
Well, that's such a huge part of the principles that I kind of uncovered, or we're talking about in my book, is that when people think tutoring, it's a lot more like, okay, so I'm dealing with this situation right now. How do I get around that, right? Like I used to have language tutoring sessions when I remember when I was doing projects to learn languages, and it would be like, okay, I go to the store and I'm trying to ask for this, and like how do I get them to like do that? Like what do I say? And then they're like, okay, you're gonna say this, or like why I don't understand how to say this, or like someone said this to me, I don't understand it, and like you're dealing with real problems and they're connected to a real situation. So I mean that's just one of the principles. So I as I discussed in the book, there's about like 9 other ones that are, or 8 other ones that I go through, but directness is definitely a really big one because it's kind of the opposite of often how we think about learning, and it's often this real barrier because actually going up and speaking to people is kind of scary, or actually writing, like I want to make a little computer game is like, oh my god, where do I start, or like, oh my god, how do I deal with this?
Mm-hmm.
And so dealing with that kind of those little like initial hurdles can often be a big part of it, is like how do you get in a situation where you can just naturally start through organic feedback improving? How do you bootstrap that? It's like
Mm-hmm.
starting a company. How do you bootstrap it when you don't have any customers and you don't have any money to pay for your costs, and et cetera,
Yeah.
right?
And actually, we've got some great questions here in the chat that we'll get to in a
Sure.
sec, but
Yeah.
you bring up a good point. I wish the message from the beginning for everybody was learning is all about figuring out, like in some ways, just saying like you can do it. And that was
Mm-hmm.
because one of my things I said to James was like, okay, sure, Atomic Habits. I could start practicing basketball every day, but I'm never going to be Michael Jordan, right? The typical kind of like
Yeah,
dick
yeah.
question.
That's not a dick question though. It's a very honest question, and I wish more people would ask it.
But the answer is sure, I might not get as good as Michael Jordan, and genetically, I'm never going to be Michael Jordan. But I can get way better at playing basketball than I am now.
Yeah.
And so, with programming specifically, I don't think I'm ever going to be a NASA level programmer, or SpaceX level programmer, or even the lead programmer on a simple web app. But I will get better than I was. I am already better than I was, and it's been so freeing to think, if I had never started, like if I hadn't done those 100+ live streams, I would still be back where I was when I was 12.
Yeah.
And so at 38 or 39, I was able to start saying, I'm going to get this. Related to that, I think, is this question here by
Sure.
Reconcile. Because I think one thing you're good at is taking big complex things and breaking them down and figuring out, like you've taught yourself a language. What else did you do? You did like something with MIT, or what was it?
Yeah. So I've done a couple projects. So we're getting like late in the podcast here. If you're listening so far, this is who the hell I am. No, so my blog, I've been writing my blog for like 13 years. And the big thing I guess I'm somewhat known for is doing these projects. And this was a big motivator for, titling the book Ultra Learning, is because that's sort of what I've been calling it. But the projects that I'm known for, so one of them was the MIT Challenge, where I wanted to learn MIT's computer science curriculum. So we can talk about the difference between computer science and just raw programming a little later. But this one, the idea was MIT posts a lot of their material online for free. So about 8 years ago, I was like, why has no one tried to like get a degree from MIT without getting a degree from MIT? Like, why has no one tried to just like take advantage of this? And so that was a project where over 12 months, I wanted to get the things that they teach in the degree by passing the final exams and doing the programming projects for the 33 classes that would be part of an MIT degree.
Yeah.
So I did that project, and then I did a different project with a friend 2 years after, which we called the Year Without English, where we went and traveled to Spain, Brazil, China, and Korea to learn Spanish, Portuguese, Mandarin, and Korean. And the way we did it was, once we landed, we didn't speak English. We only spoke the language we were trying to learn, and it worked pretty well. We were able to have like conversations and make friends and, do all that kind of thing in each of those countries.
Wow. By the way, how much do you think in terms of motivation? Because in those examples,
Yeah.
there's something, I don't know if this is the right word, performative about that. Like
Yeah.
you are you're performing to a certain extent for an audience in that case. And I only mention that because that's very motivating to me,
Hmm.
and it's not often talked about.
Yeah.
Like part of the reason I think this works is because I like to perform, and so when I'm performing, there's something already motivating about it.
Hmm.
So like the idea of like just shutting myself in a closet and reading a programming book is super boring to me. But the idea of
Yeah.
performing is really exciting. How much do you think that plays into your motivation
I
to?
definitely plays into the motivation. I think you do have to have that internal wellspring of motivation, because if the only reason I was doing it is because people are giving me thumbs up and likes on my videos all the time, like when I was doing the MIT challenge, people got really excited about it when it was finished. In like the first 2 weeks when I announced I was going to do it, it was like mostly negative feedback. So it's mostly like, there's no effing way that you're going to do this.
Mhm.
Like, kind of like, screw you. Like, there was a lot of comments like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So that can be a little motivating just because you're like, well, I have to like show them wrong or something. But definitely it's more like that. And then there's like, it's a year-long thing. So like people just like, all right, whatever. And then there's like long periods of silence where you don't get any comments, or you get like one comment. Like, I wasn't live streaming it. I was doing it just sort of on my own. So it was
Yeah.
like once a week you get a comment. So you have to be internally motivated, but just the idea that you are doing this live, I think it makes you rise to a better version of yourself than if you were like, well, if I just like sit around and drink all day and don't actually
Yeah.
do anything, like no one's gonna care. Like if you take that attitude, it is harder. And so definitely the project that I did with the language learning, like, I remember meeting people. This was in Spain in particular when we were like the most strict about the rule.
Mhm.
And I had this friend, and he speaks Spanish, but his wife didn't. And so I was speaking to her in Spanish, and then he would translate in English. And it was a little bit like, okay, that's kind of a dick thing to do. But it was just like we were committed. We were committed to doing this right now, and that was how we would communicate. She was kind of joking about it, laughing, like, how funny was that? That like I've never actually heard you speak in English. You're only speaking in Spanish. And I mean, if I weren't like making such a big deal about this being the guiding principle of the project, maybe I'd been like, okay, now it's all right to speak in English because this person doesn't actually speak Spanish, or maybe you would have toned it down a little bit. But in the same end, I remember being in France when I was trying to learn French, and I was just like, well, I'm just going to learn as much French as I can. And I spoke French like 20% of the time because it's always easier to speak in English, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes doing the crazy things, sometimes doing the performative, it's in public eye, you're going a little too extreme. That can almost be the good thing to do because it keeps you accountable and it keeps you motivated, right?
Yeah, I got to figure that what that is, because we've even noticed that with podcasting, for example.
Yeah.
I would do my podcast with my co-founder, whether anyone was watching or listening or not, because just us talking every week, but talking in almost a way that we're also performing. Like the microphones add this weird. I think it's what you said. It's you have to be a better version of yourself, and so when you're learning something, you really do have to kind of be a better version of yourself. Like you can't just be the guy that eats Doritos and plays PlayStation all day, right? You have to be like, no, I'm the kind of guy that gets off the couch and goes to the cafe and tries to speak to someone in a different language, right? Like it's a better version of yourself. It's not the normal version. It's like you're operating at a higher level.
Well, I think also one of the big things, and this is sort of part of the idea baked in ultra learning, is that a lot of learning kind of at its core involves a process of frustration and fear. So frustration, obviously, we were just talking about setting up a new programming language is like, that's the crack cocaine of frustration. Like that is just like nonstop and unending frustration and making you feel dumb.
Yeah.
But like speaking a new language to new people is like that, but in fear form. It's like, oh, I'm gonna go out there and talk to someone and embarrass myself, and I'm going to feel bad about it. And often, so this is sort of a psychological principle of exposure therapy, that like the way you overcome these things is to expose yourself to it, so you reduce the emotional reactivity you have toward it. So for me, I find that doing these kind of intense projects, you kind of build this obsession and motivation to get started. And then once you get started, because all the frustrations are like bam, 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 bam. At a certain point, you're just kind of like, oh, whatever, things not working out. This is just another day, another dollar. Like,
Yeah.
or when you're speaking another language, you're like, oh, you think I'm an idiot? Yeah, this is just par for the course. This is just every day for me. And the thing is that when you are comfortable being an idiot, when you're comfortable being frustrated nonstop, and then
Yeah.
that just becomes normal, you actually learn really quickly. So when you look back there for 3 months, you're like, oh, holy crap, how'd you learn this fast? It's like, by being an idiot for 3 months. That's how I learned it this fast.
Yes. Yeah, I think that is so key, is
Mm-hmm.
the willingness to, and this is something we're trying to talk to our kids about. Like I'll say to my son, hey, I signed you up for a programming class. And he'll say, but I don't know any programming. I can't go to that. I said, but that's the point. You don't know something before, but there's ego, right? Or I signed my son up for a downhill mountain biking camp. His number one worry is I'm not good at I'm not going to be as good as the other kids, right? There's so much like ego, and I found you really almost have to kill the ego and say, I'm willing to look like a dummy. I'm not going to care, and like not caring what people think. Because if you're going to, for example, try to speak French to someone in a French cafe, you will look like an awkward idiot. Like you're going to be trying to think of things and you won't be able to think of them.
It's funny you say this because we're talking about, I think it requires, sort of ironically, it requires a certain amount of confidence to let go of your ego in this way, because I've definitely been in situations. Language learning is the best example for me because everyone has their pet theory of how you have to learn the language. And I've had tutoring sessions where I'm like, my level of ability is like garbage. And I'm kind of like, no, I want to like do this entire session in this language. And you're just going to sit there while I go and Google Translate and like translate every single one of my sentences into this thing. And you're just going to listen to me. And then when you say it, you're going to type it as well so that I can copy it into Google Translate. And they're like, no, that's not how you do things. And it takes a certain amount to be like, well, no, if you don't want to do it this way, I'll find someone else because this is how I'm going to do it. And I think a lot of people, they get bullied into doing something that doesn't feel right for them. They're kind of like, oh, no, this isn't how I'm going to do this. I'm not learning this. I'm not getting better at this. Or I need this and I'm not getting this, because everyone's like, no, you need to do this. So the person who just hands you the programming book and like, no, study this first before you come here. Like, don't waste my time if you're not going to do this. And I think it takes a certain amount of, like, for me, I've had enough positive experiences that I'm willing to be like a complete idiot and be like, you know what, no, but I'm actually like, I can do this some of the time. But I think about all those times when I didn't have those positive experiences where someone saying that would have totally shut me down. I would have been like, oh, I guess I can't do it that way, or I guess I'm not good at this. And so it's funny how much that kind of that confidence spiral is so important for being able to, get past it, do that.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get to this question by Reconcile.
Sure.
He says, I have a question that's a bit more specific than the overall concept of learning. How do you transition from creating simple console apps to creating full-scale apps with GUIs, etc.? That's where things start to get slightly overwhelming for me personally. And this seems this seems common, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's like, okay, I can get started small, Scott Young,
Yeah.
but at some point, how do I transition into something harder?
Yeah, well, I don't think so. There's a couple ways you could do it. One would just be if you have some idea of the app you want to create. So we're like, I'm going to make a web app that, is like Twitter, but for dogs, or I don't know what it's going to be like. We're making fun of like startup ideas, but something like you already have the idea, then you could just get started with that. Most people who are doing programming, I would say that the standard way of approaching it these days is some kind of agile development as opposed to the waterfall design. So the idea is that even if you're starting with something full scale, it always starts with like some kind of toy version that just gets bigger. Like that's usually the way people suggest it. So if you're afraid of doing GUIs, then like why don't you make like the simplest possible GUI app just so you can figure out how the heck the GUI works, right? So if you're going to try to be like, okay, well, I know it needs to have these three things. Okay, well, let's figure out how to do thing number one first in like the smallest possible way, and then thing number two, and then thing number three, and then you combine those three things together. And so really, I think there is sometimes a barrier people have with like, when do I do real programming? Like I'm not doing real programming yet, but real programming is just an accumulation of all the non-real programming things that you're learning. And so if there's some little piece that you don't understand, then you just break it apart and make a little toy of that, break it apart, make a little toy of that, and then put your toys together and like make something a little bit more complicated. And that's how you build that confidence doing it, that really like anything that you want to be able to do, there's probably like, again, specific libraries and plugins, and, you know, it's good to use this approach and that approach. I think, again, the best way to start is just start with like, what is the dumbest, simplest thing that I can do that is the thing that I'm scared of? And then once you've like, okay, I kind of get how this works. And sometimes like GUIs are also a thing that like they involve a different kind of programming, because often you're dealing with like it's essentially concurrent programming, that you have to have like little buttons, and then you have to make a listener for the button so that when someone clicks on it, then that'll trigger something. And this is actually not trivial programming. Like anyone who's done any like, you know, built concurrent apps on their own know that it's like a minefield to debug and work on and stuff, because you know, there's all these race conditions and things like this. So if you're working on concurrent programming, if you're working on that, yeah, it is going to be a little difficult. But if you just made a simple thing that like, okay, every time I click the button, it puts a message to the console. Okay, that's a starting point, right? And then, okay, now let's make a drop-down menu, or let's make a, like, how do we make some radio buttons? And you go through the like, little documentation, and let's try out each of these buttons. And like, okay, I'm going to now make a game that like, you know, plays Minesweeper or something, and that's going to be my next little project, and it's going to take me like a week or two, but I'll get it done. And then you move on to doing it in the other way. So it's all about like, how do you take something big like that and break it down into little tiny things that don't feel as scary and you're making progress in.
Yeah, you know, one thing you've said that really is hitting me is how these mental models we have of what the way we think something should look, how that restricts us. So people have this idea in their head of what a programmer looks like, or what programming looks like. And so they're already setting themselves up for, well, it's going to be like super, you know, technical and hard to understand, and you have to be really smart, and it's going to be complex. Like everything's going to be complex. Or like, this is the way it should be. Like here's an example. Again, my 13-year-old son, he's trying to learn Game Maker, which is a way of programming video games. And he's doing it on his own. And he's doing everything by hand. He's like, you know, he's doing a tutorial. And the tutorials, of course, are showing you like, well, here's how you figure out gravity, and here's how you do it. And eventually he just gets bogged down in the details and stops. Then I enrolled him in a course, a little 3-day course. And the first day, the teacher said, well, there are libraries that you can get that do all that stuff for you, that abstract all that stuff for you. And I think at first Marty was like, well, isn't that cheating? And then and the teacher goes, well, for a lot of projects, that's all you need. And if your goal is to make a game, why not just start with that? And then if you need to, and so he figured out he could download these libraries. And then he found out, oh, I don't like the way the gravity works in the library, but that's what I can modify. Instead of trying to tackle this whole thing and instead of trying to, you know, make this thing a big thing where you got to figure out every single thing that's ever been figured out in computer science and programming. Just download the library.
Learning to cheat, I love that thing, because I think that that's like the heart of learning a lot of skills, is that you cheat, and you don't realize until you get further that most people are cheaters. If we're like using this definition of cheaters, that like, we were just talking before this went on, that like I do programming, and I've learned it, but I'm mostly a writer. And so for me, it makes sense to like, I hire people to do things. So one of the things I hire people to do is programming for my website, especially a lot of like, you know, I'm not a beautiful website designer, so I'm just a guy who does that really well. And the thing I know from working with him is that he very rarely does any programming. Like he almost always is like, is there a plugin that does this already? So he's cheating every day, and he's a full-time paid programmer. So, I mean, you're going to be in the same situation. And it's not even just about programming. Like we're talking about language learning as well. And language learning is a perfect example that like, I've had situations where, you know, someone wants to know like the right way to say something, and you're like, I don't know, you could just point at the thing that you want and be like, like this, like, and And that is going to accomplish your communication goal in that situation. Maybe it's not the most elegant way to do it. Maybe there's like a better, more fancy phrase you can say to do that, but that's a way you could start right now. And from that little communication kernel, you could like, okay, maybe instead of just going, like maybe I can say like that, or like, I
Mm-hmm.
want, or like this kind of thing, and build it out of that. And so I think very often we think of learning as like, well, learning is about putting stuff in your head. And I think learning is about bridging the gap between the things you want to do and the things and like what you have to do it, right? So it's kind of a bridge between where you are right now and this thing that you want to be able to do. And so if you think of it as a bridge, there's lots of different bridges you could build. Like sometimes it's a short bridge that involves some shortcut, or sometimes it's a, very sophisticated, sturdy bridge that will handle a lot of traffic. And so very often when you're starting, you want that short little bridge so you can get in that environment where you're actually doing things and making the game, and then you're making your own gravity and whatnot.
Yeah, I just typed down the time code for that because when you said learning is a bridge between, can you say that again? Learning is a bridge.
Oh, I'm not sure I even said it the first time. Learning is a bridge between like where you are right now and what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes that's going to be, again, like a kind of a rickety sort of shortcut bridge where you like use something someone else made, and it's like you're kind of piecing some things together and you can get the job done. And sometimes it's going to be really sophisticated. You've built it from scratch. It's exactly what you want, exactly what you need. But if you view it in this bridge metaphor, there's not like, well, one of them was cheating and one of them was the real bridge or the real thing you wanted to make. It just depends on what you want to be able to accomplish.
That's right. And I think this is something Adam Patterson said in the chat is that, people start using something like Squarespace or Wix or Shopify, and those are good to a point, right? For example, I've been using WordPress forever, and I almost always just use an existing theme that at first I didn't customize at all. Then I start customizing it more. And finally, this past year, after many false starts, I finally built a website, mostly from scratch, although still using a framework called Tailwind, but mostly from scratch. I finally was able to get there, but we're talking about years and years and years of using built-in solutions and really almost feeling my dissatisfaction with them. Like, oh, I don't like the way this looks, or, oh, I could, if I could make this load faster, it would be better. And just building up my motivation until finally I'm like, okay, I'm just going to figure this out. Right.
Yeah.
And, if I'd gone right to that, I think it would have been too big of a jump. Because at first, I just wanted a website. Right? And then I just want, like you kind of climb the ladder a little bit.
Well, I think, again, I don't want to discourage anyone. Like if your passion is to do this, like, I want to build this from scratch and that's what I really want to do, then like do that, right? I think the point here is just that a lot of people have all these rules and conventions in their head that like, well, you got to do it the legit way. Otherwise, people aren't going to respect you, or you're not going to get an A+ on your exam, or, everyone's going to like look down on you because you're not a real programmer. You're not really doing this. You're just faking it. And I think if you kind of open yourself up to like, okay, what are some other ways I could do it? You can get around some of these frustrations.
Yeah. Okay. This is a good question because this is something I've wrestled with for a long time. How are you doing for time, by the way? You got to.
I'm good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I got some time. Yeah, I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, we're Pacific time, right? It's only 4:00 in the afternoon.
Yeah.
So I always say your name wrong. I think it's Merot or Merot, something like that. How can online instructors create courses that encourage active learning and directness? I think he was saying, like a direct application, because most online courses are just instructors, showing us things. Here's the video, here's the textbook or whatever.
Yeah. So again, I'm going to go back to this conversation I had with this woman, this instructor at a business school, and she was like, "Well, I'm trying to get the kids to do these things, and they don't want to do it." And so for me, I didn't write my book to change the education system. I didn't write it so that teachers could be like, "Well, now I know how to teach kids." It's a good thing that Scott told me how to teach. I didn't know anything from all those years I spent studying it.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that this is a book for students, because it's a book for learners. It's a book for people who want to teach themselves things, because I think the best way that you can take advantage of online courses is to be a good student. So the truth is that online courses are really useful tools. So if you're trying to learn something well, they're often built with a lot of ideas in mind. The problem is often how you approach it. So I'll give a good example. So I talked a little bit about my MIT Challenge project and trying to do MIT's computer science curriculum. Now, I'm not saying you have to do that. Obviously, if you want to learn programming, you don't have to do that. That's a particular goal if you're interested.
Yeah.
But one of the comments I get from people who sometimes say, you know what, I'd like to do something similar, is they're like, well, this class doesn't have any lecture videos, so what do I do? And the problem is not that lecture videos are bad. I like lecture videos. I like having someone tell me what to do. The problem is thinking that the lecture video is how you learn the material. It's not. The most important thing, so I'm not saying this isn't also an insurmountable obstacle, but if you're learning, let's say, if you're learning a course where you actually have to do some math, like let's say you're learning differential equations, the most important resource you can have is practice questions with solutions, because you learn it by doing it, not by having someone explain it. The explaining it helps. So you often need an explanation to start doing the practice questions, but don't think of the learning as primarily being the watching. The learning is primarily the doing, and the watching helps the doing. And so that is the right way to think about these online courses, is that they can show you things. They can even give you homework assignments. They can, give you suggestions for projects and get you started. So I definitely encourage people to check out online courses if they like them. But the right way to think of it is that the thing you should be thinking is, okay, I'm taking this online course so that I can do X, or so that I can start practicing Y. And if you just do it completely divorced from any kind of application, you're often going to have these issues of transfer, and they're going to come up. And you know what? The funny thing is this isn't just for learning practical skills. So I was working with a guy who wanted to learn military history. So talk about something that's never going to be like, I'm going to apply my military history today, build this trebuchet.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And the thing is we were talking about this, and you read history books and you're going to forget most of that, or you read a book and you're not going to really understand the deep picture just by reading this book. So what he decided he was going to do for his project was he was going to write these little book reviews and essays where he was going to synthesize, this is what the book covered. These were the main ideas. This is the stuff I want to remember. And so the product of him making these little essays, or even thinking about making the essays as he's reading the book, changes how he uses his attention, changes what he recalls, changes what he remembers, so that he learns it more effectively. So for me, I've really learned cognitive science researching for this book, because I had to read all these papers to okay, well, what's going on here? And I don't understand this effect, and let me call this researcher up and stuff.
Yeah.
And so if you think about learning as doing primarily and only watching and reading as support activities, I think you're going to have the right ratio and the right approach to things.
Yeah. And you brought up something that an effective technique, I think, when you're learning something is around the dinner table or when you're hanging out with friends to reiterate what you're learning. That's one of the best gifts you can give your kids or your friends that are learning something. Hey, what are you learning in that course? Tell me. Hey, what's that book about? And when that's when people have to go, okay, yeah, they have to reiterate it in their own words. And it's also exciting to share what you're learning, right? And I think that's something that, for me anyway, has been helpful, is to just have even people in my life that are willing to go, okay, I'll listen to hear what you're learning, right? And to be open to that to other people. Okay, so, you're taking that course, tell me what you're learning. And even if I don't completely understand it, I know that it's valuable for them to reiterate what they've processed that day.
So I'll tell you something that this is a study that I really love that's kind of related to this. And it's related to what the author calls the problem of explanatory depth. It's a super technical name.
Okay.
But basically what it means is that if I ask you, what's the capital of France?
Yeah.
You either know it or you don't.
Yeah. But
interestingly enough, you know that you know it or that you don't know it. So either Paris comes up in your head or it doesn't. And you're like, I guess I don't know. So if I asked you what's the capital of Mongolia, either Ulaanbaatar is going to come up or it's not, right? So if it doesn't, you didn't hear Ulaanbaatar, you're like, nah, I actually don't know what the capital of Mongolia is. Okay, so for factual subjects, we have really good sort of what you could call metacognition. We have really good self-understanding of what we know. Explanations, however, are different, and that's because explanations can happen at varying depths or for varying purposes. So I'll give you another one. Do you know how a bicycle works?
Uh,
So again, you're going to feel a little bit bad because I'm putting you on the spot here.
mhm.
But one of the things they asked in the study is get people to draw a bicycle. Now, I'm not saying like an artistic, photorealistic rendering. I'm just saying, could you say where the chains are attached and where the wheels and handlebars and stuff go? This
Mhm.
seems pretty easy. I mean, we've all ridden on bicycles, and I mean, like I don't have the pictures. If you look at this, so if you look at it's called psychology, like with like
Okay, yeah.
psychology, the illusion of explanatory depth. You can find the paper and you can look at these pictures, and it is hilarious. They had people who are like avid cyclists, and they're drawing the chain connecting to both the wheels, which if you think about it for a little bit, that bicycle can't work. Like it won't work if the gears are like riding both of the bicycle at the same time. They don't realize, no, the gears are only attached to the back bicycle wheel. They're not attached to the front one, or like the handlebars are not. This is like a rigid bicycle. You can't turn the handles and various things like this. And so the reason that the author kind of explored this and found this out is that when you ask someone, how well do you understand X, that's actually really difficult to self-assess.
Mhm.
So when we were talking about like, do you know what a function is? You were kind of like, oh, I'm not actually sure what a function is. But it's also not like the what's the capital of Mongolia question, that it's kind of like, I actually don't know how much I know about functions or exactly what they mean or what they do. It kind of depends on what question you're asking about them. And
Mhm.
so the reason that what you're talking about, this kind of like teaching it to someone else, is that you reveal these weaknesses in your own understanding.
Mhm.
So one of the things, this is a school problem, but it applies to learning all sorts of things, is that I remember being in school and kids would say things like, well, you know what, I knew all I studied so hard, I know all this stuff. But then they were asking all these weird questions and I couldn't answer it.
Mhm.
And the problem is that when they were studying, they didn't have any of this feedback on like how well do you actually understand the material. So they think, I've been studying for hours, I know all of it. And then they take the test and they're like, oh, actually, I don't know anything.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so if you go and you try to say, okay, you're going to talk to your kids and you're going to say, I'm going to tell you what a function is,
Yeah.
right? And like, maybe you're saying, okay, it's a little bit like a pencil sharpener. You put raw pencils in and you get sharpened pencils out, and it's got some gears on the inside. So anyways, like you do this and you realize quickly how much you understand about functions, and you don't.
Mhm.
So like when it says, okay, well, what does it mean to pass a variable by reference? Well, what
Mhm.
does that mean, right?
Mhm.
Like, I don't know what that means. And then now you don't know what you mean by that. You can go ask someone, well, what does it mean when you put this little asterisk next to the variable name? What is that doing right there, right? What is
Mhm.
that different from the other way of doing it? Or what does it mean when, like, why is in this function, why is self the first parameter of this one? Like, what does that mean?
Mhm.
What does that mean? And so this is a really important learning technique of explaining to other people or to yourself, even just to reveal these gaps in your understanding.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, it's been really helpful to me, and
Mhm.
yeah, that's that's good. Um, what? Let me just get my bearings here.
Got in bicycle territory, and
We
now
got
you're like stuck in spinning wheels and gears and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if the another. I just want to go back to this teaching thing,
Yeah.
because you said a lot of it has to depend on the learner,
Hmm.
but that really sucks if you've got a bunch of students.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, is there anything we can do? And maybe it is using that, like having people explain it in their own words is one technique. Are there other techniques teachers can or
Well, step one is to buy all your students my book. No, I'm just joking. No, but I would say like, because I've taught courses and I teach things as well. And the first thing you have to realize is that, like, again, like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So you have to do what you can to prepare the students. But at the end of the day, if a student is only there to get the grade and they don't care about really learning it, you can't make them care. You can make it more interesting, you can make it more fun. But if it's like, nah, I just want to get a C plus and get on with my life, you know, maybe that student's just going to get a C plus and get on with their life.
Mhm.
So what I would say is, often I think when you talk to students, is explain to them how they're actually going to learn it. Explain to them what they can get from what you're going to give them and what they need to get to where they actually need to go. And so
Mhm.
I think, for instance, in a language learning class, if I were teaching a language learning class, the thing I would open up with is like, okay, half of you are not really that serious about learning this language. That's cool. If you just want to hear, you're just here to, like, get a feel for it, and you decide if you want to commit later, that's fine. But for those of you who are really committed, get a partner right now, and you two are going to be language partners. And after the class is done, you're going to spend half an hour after every class trying to chat to each other in the language. And you're going to write down words that you don't know how to say, and you're going to write down things. And I'm even going to be around in the class and I can help you, but we'll work on that, right? And I think that's the kind of thing that like that's actually going to be what the student's going to need to do to have those conversations. But if I just say, oh, and remember, kids, you got to remember to practice all the time. Okay, well, then I'm going to do that, right?
Yeah.
And I think you can also change how you structure your class so that it has fewer of these problems. So we're talking about directness, and directness I'm talking about it in a fairly simplified way, but it's actually kind of complicated. So I've been learning salsa dancing with my wife, so I'll use salsa dancing as an example.
Okay.
Right? I'm a great dancer, so I'm not going to give you any wonderful dancing tips. I'm only learning for a few months.
Yeah.
But one of the things I noticed from the class is the way that the teacher likes to teach is they like to use established choreography. So it'll be like, okay, today we're going to learn this. You're going to spin them here, and then you're going to step under, and then you're going to spin. And it's kind of complicated because you got to do it all, and you got to do it in the rhythm and this kind of thing. But one of the things is that you go to social dancing, which is like just a party after where people are dancing and no one's telling you the choreography.
Yeah.
And you suck and you're terrible. And you're like, why? I wasn't learning it very well. And the reason why is because you were learning some things. So there were some parts of the skill that you were mastering in the choreography. One of the important things you weren't mastering is how do you communicate to your partner that I want you to do this? Because they already know that you want them to do this. So I don't really, as a lead, have to like move my hand at exactly the right moment or exactly the right way to tell you, okay, no, I want you to turn this way or I want you to do this because you already knew you were going to do that. So I could just put my hand down. You're going to do the same thing because you know what's coming.
Yeah.
And so for this situation, it's also something that like if I were again teaching this salsa class and my goal was to, help people do social dancing, I would be like, okay, now we're going to have one where, maybe I'm not going to tell you what you're going to do, or the leads are going to know something, but the follows are not going to know what they're doing. And so you have to actually practice that. So for a lot of teachers, often what I look at is if you're teaching a skill, try to figure out not just what are the kind of big components of the skill that you're teaching in the class, but what are all the little sort of connective tissue that this person would need to do it in real life and give them resources to do that. So if you're teaching programming, show them how to install the freaking developer environment, right? Because otherwise they're going to be frustrated and be like, oh, screw this when they get home.
Yeah. And one thing you said there that I think is so important is figure out where they want to go. Like, why are they doing this?
Yeah.
So if, for example, I bought a course on how to use my camera, but all I really wanted to know was like just a few settings for video so that I could like set it up and do some talking head video. And so I've used maybe 5% of the course. And seriously, I've spent maybe 5-10 minutes in the course. Perfect. I got what I wanted, right? Yeah. And I think as a teacher, he could be disappointed. He could be like, well, this guy only finished like 1% of my course. Brutal. But for me, I got exactly where I wanted to go. And so, if you sign up for salsa lessons, well, what do you want to accomplish? Well, we just want to look semi-good at the wedding that's coming up in 3 months.
Yeah.
Knowing why they're there, what's the job to be done here? I think if what you're trying to do, if learning is the bridge between where you are and where people want to go, as teachers, we can say, okay, well, if that's where you want to go, well, I can just teach you, enough for you to look good, right? And if that's where you want to stop, perfect. But if you set up all the scaffolding for, painting an entire building when all they want you to do is paint the fence, you're setting, like, why would you do that?
Oh, you know what? I'll tell you a good example because this is something that like is really common if you're learning Chinese. So if you're learning Mandarin Chinese, I don't know why they do this because it just drives me crazy. But a lot of classes, not all of them, so I'm not criticizing every class, but there's a lot of classes that they will let you they'll make you do like 2 years worth of like intense handwriting drills, like to do the calligraphy, to draw all the characters. This is super dumb. This is super dumb for a couple reasons. One, learning to recognize the characters is a much, much easier task than learning to write all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Like I would say that I can read Chinese fairly fluently now. If you ask me to like write down simple sentences with a pencil and paper, it would be garbage.
Yeah.
So it's actually a lot easier to learn to recognize. So it's absolutely not necessary to learn to handwrite if you just want to read things, because you can also just enter it with letters in your keyboard. And second, a lot of people don't even care about reading and writing at all. They only care about having conversations with people.
Mm-hmm.
So learning the characters, again, beyond just a little bit like, okay, this is the character they're using when they're saying this, maybe that'll help you remember it. If you're going beyond that, if you're going into just like, okay, we're going to memorize how to like perfectly do your handwriting strokes, you're not doing what the student actually wants. And so I think this is one of the problems of the one size fits all big classroom environment, is that the teacher decides what they think is important from their perspective and not from the student's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so computer science faculty, I often find, get in this trap, is that a lot of computer science programs teach computer science from the perspective of, well, we're computer science professors, so we don't do actually that much programming. We're mostly proving theorems in math of like, let's prove like that this problem belongs to this arbitrary complexity class, or that this program will perfectly solve all situations and all times.
Yeah.
And this is not actually what you're actually doing when you're programming most of the time.
Yeah.
And so I've definitely encountered the attitude that a lot of computer science professors think, oh, well, programming is something that you'll just pick that up. But I'm going to teach you what really matters, which is computational theory or advanced algorithms. And I mean, that's great if you want to learn computational theory and advanced algorithms. But if you just really wanted to build a website, you're kind of like, oh my God, I have to know all this to build the website.
Yes.
And you don't realize, no, you don't need to know any of that to build the website.
Yes. I think like this is, this is really kind of pumping me up, because I think, first of all, I think on one hand, my preconceived notion of like you and people like you is just this like, I always felt like, well, that's not for me, because I'm not like trying to like, I don't know. I wouldn't even like what you've done in this conversation is you've made it practical for me. Like it feels grounded, that this isn't about like, trying to, I don't know, learn a whole MIT program in 2 weeks. This is like, there's some practical application to this. Like if you just understand some of the pillars that you've identified, and they're very simple. Like it's like learning is a bridge between where you are and where you want to go. So if that's true, why are you doing all that other stuff that's not effective? And then it opens up the door. You're almost giving people permission to say, okay, well, if you want to build a website, maybe the best way to learn is to start building the website. Right?
Yeah. Real wild stuff.
Real wild stuff. Now, maybe just to close, I think some folks, the part of the struggle with this is that it really does put the onus on the learner. And, it took me 38 years to figure out, oh, wait, like for me, I can pull in these kind of resources. How do people figure out what is right for them? Like, how do they figure out what resources to pull in? How do they figure out where to go? Like, is there any sort of framework for figuring that out?
Yeah. So we were talking about the principles of ultralearning. The first one that I start with is what I call meta learning. So meta is usually when something is about itself. So meta learning is like a fancy way of saying learning about learning. And this is really important, because if you are going to be the driver in your own kind of self-education vehicle, and you're the one taking yourself to the destination, you have to kind of get a sense of the map. So I sort of view this as like, if you're going to go on a trip, you need to get the map. You need to pack your suitcase. And so one of the things you can do is, so if we're talking about programming, I mean, how do you learn programming? You type that into Google, you'll get a million answers. And often what you do is you just, open a Word document and just, okay, this person's suggesting this book, or this person's suggesting this tool, and you put them in and you're like, all right, maybe I'll try this one or try that one. It's a little bit like planning a trip. If like I were to say to you, okay, you want to go to Italy on trip, where should you go? Well, you just type into Google, where should I go in Italy? And then you're going to just start reading stuff and reading more things and reading more things. And you're going to be kind of like, well, this guy was saying Milan, but actually I don't think I want to go to Milan. I want to go to here, because you've learned about enough of the places. You're kind of like, this is probably a good starting point. The second thing I would say is that you have a lot of backups. So when you start learning and you're like, oh, wait, I got this book, but this is like really not what I wanted to do. And I'm finding it like not helpful for me or frustrating. Okay, you get a different book or you get a different process or different tutorial. And so really what I hope to do with this book was to just expand people's minds to like, oh, there's actually tons and tons and tons and tons of ways to approach things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not going to tell you what the right way is for you, but it's going to help you get unstuck if you feel like the only ways you've encountered how to do something aren't working for you.
Yeah.
So, it's funny, you made a comment about learning and about how, that is one of the things. I do try to share stories that I think people will find exciting and interesting. And sometimes those are big dramatic stories, but then that feels completely unrelatable. Like, okay, that's other people do that. I'm not interested in doing that. But the truth is, learning is like a fundamental process of life. Every single moment you're learning how to do new things. You just don't think about it as learning. You think about it as, well, I have to figure out how to do my taxes, or I have to figure out, how to get in contact with this person who's going to help me figure out my taxes, or like, how am I going to figure out this and that? And so if you start to take that learning lens to these problems, you realize that you're learning constantly and you actually know a lot about learning, and that this book that I've been trying to write has just been sort of, how do you apply the things that you already know how to learn well and that you've done successfully in the past? How do you apply those principles to the things that you've struggled with?
Yes.
So.
Yeah. Sweet, man. Well, I'm excited to dig into it. So people can get it on August 6th.
Yes, August 6th, the book is going to be out. I know there's a few people that are listening a bit early, so if you do decide to purchase, just go to my website. I have some things that I'm giving away for the pre-order. And definitely, if you check out the book, it's going to be available Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the major ones. Audible, if you prefer listening to a book, as I often do, you can listen to me to recite the book to you.
Nice. You've done the
Yeah,
the
I did the narration too, yeah.
So Scott H. Young is your website. And right now you can pre-order the book right now. What happens when I click on this? I go to like Amazon and everything else. Okay, great. Yeah, so scotthyoung.com. Scott, thanks so much for sharing this past hour and a half.
It's been a great conversation. Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where you get with programming, because I think it's always really inspiring to see someone tackle something that they've always wanted to learn and struggled with in the past and really go after it.
Yeah, well, the headline you have here is, being able to master hard skills quickly is essential to your work and life. This book will show you how. And I think so much of my frustration, like I open with, is just been, I have anxiety about whether I am learning the right way. And so if this is kind of book, if this is designed to give clarity around that, then that sounds right up my alley. So I'm looking forward to digging into this. All right, folks, thanks for listening and watching live. If you're out there, thanks for the great questions. Scott, I think I'm going to redo our intro just so I have a backup.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
And I'll probably redo the outro, and then we'll be good. So let me do.
Are we still live right now, or do you want me to pause it?
Yeah, we're still live right now. That's fine. They can watch. They can watch how the song.
They can watch us do it. Do you want me to I've still got the audio recording going.
Yeah, still record the audio.
So, okay, cool.
Hey folks, today I'm talking to Scott Young. How's it going, Scott?
Oh, it's great to be here.
Man, people who are watching the live stream are going to be confused by that.
Yeah, I love it.
All right. Hey folks,
this is behind the scenes right now, guys. This is
so Scott and I met back in 2017 at a little retreat right out in Colorado. And we were both Canadians, so that we had that in common. You're from where?
Well, I'm originally from Manitoba, but I live in Vancouver right now, so we're both West Coast right now.
We're both in the West Coast right now. Yeah. And Scott has been blogging for a long time at scotthyoung.com. What do you usually tell people that you write about?
Oh, geez, that's a good question. I usually tell people I write about learning and self-improvement and productivity and all sorts of stuff. But yeah, definitely check out the website. Yeah,
in the learning sphere. And one thing I've said to folks is like, no, I'm not going to say that. No.
What have you said to folks, Justin?
Yeah, I was going to. No. Okay, I think that'll be enough. I can stitch together, and then
right.
Let me close it off again. So, Scott, thanks so much for talking about all this today. Where can people find out more about the book, Ultra Learning?
So definitely come to my website, scotthyoung.com. There's links to the book and also all the articles I've written as well. So you can definitely check that out. We've got links to all the retails that you might want to get. And if you just Google Ultra Learning, it should be probably up there.
Yeah.
Definitely the top 3. It should be my book.
Yeah, and it's kind of well, is it a green? It's an aqua. It's a
So it's interesting enough. This is the book. This is what it looks like. This is the American cover. So if you get it in North America, it will look like this.
okay.
For some reason, the UK version is like a yellow cover. So if you see the yellow cover and you're like, "What's this? Is this a fake version of the book?" No. It's actually the book. It's just, I don't know. They like to do different covers there. So it's a different cover book. So if you're in the UK or you're in Europe, that would probably be the one that you would be ordering.
Cool. Thanks again, man.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Okay, live folks, we are going to shut this off now. Thanks again for showing up.
See you.